Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Smallville Season 1, Episodes 9 and 10. So, within Episode 9, we kind of take this little break from the whole Freak of the Week thing, and we go on and we have a normal Joe Schmo guy that is to go up against Clark, because, of course, in Episode 9, we go on and have, of course, Clark being blackmailed for eventually having a normal guy go on and see Clark use his abilities. And within episode 10, we go on and have a person who is to have this flower somehow that is to make them invisible. And so eventually the whole episode is to try to figure out who is the actual invisible person within the episode. But between these two episodes, we of course had the connecting thing of Victoria Hardwick, who is to be Lex Luthor's love interest, so that's cool. That eventually we have Victoria, who is tied to Lex via a business relationship, because of course Victoria is to be working with a guy named Sir Harry, who seems to have his own business and is trying to figure out a way to snag Luthor Corp along with having their own business. And so Lex is to go on and say, like, well, hey, like, instead of just going on and just stealing one business, how about we just steal them both? Like, we both work together and so on and so forth. And Victoria's like, yeah, no. So eventually Victoria is to go on and try to find out Luthor Corp information, and eventually Clark is to find out about it, and eventually tells Lex about that in some part of this episodes. So, we also have Clark, who is to go on and be dealing with possibly his own relationship kind of issues, because of course Whitney is to decide to create some distance between him and Lana, and Clark is like, ooh, maybe I can swoop in now and go on and be Lana's boyfriend finally. And come to find out, Clark instead decides to do the right thing and creates distance between him and Lana, so that way Lana can go on and run back to Whitney, so that way Whitney can go on and tell Lana the truth about why Whitney was to have gone on and not wanted Lana to be around. And so I was like, wow, that's that's kind of a nice thing for Clark to do. But when really looking at it, it's like Clark could have had a girlfriend. Clark could have had a girlfriend, but no. Clark decides, no, I'm going to try to do the right thing, and so on and so forth. So, these episodes, I would say that they're both good. It seems like they are better than kind of the goofy ideas that the last two episodes were. So, I liked these episodes. I didn't feel like they were kind of filler episodes. I thought that they were fun. So definitely a thumbs up. Like, they felt probably they felt okay. Like, they felt like a solid okay for both of these episodes. But yeah, so let's go on into really just going into spoilers. I kind of tiptoed my way in there anyways, so let's go on and eventually just go into what would be usually spoiler time. Like, honestly, I wish I had more to say about these episodes. I wish I had more, like, insight and whatever about all of them, but I just don't. Like, normally once we get further and further into me talking about these episodes, like, there wasn't anything goofy that I saw through any of them. In episode 10, we go on and find out that a flower somehow is to be able to make people invisible. Oddly, in episode 10, like this flower material that eventually is to be this kind of green goop that is to somehow make people invisible. I guess maybe it was a meteorited flower. I don't know. They didn't go into that specific, but anyways, let's go on into that double 5 time territory, because it's about that time just again to go into what, of course, is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we're going to spoil this episode. So, in the beginning of this episode 9, we, of course, have Clark and Lex that are in this museum. And Lex is to go on about that the armor, or the chess piece that they have in this museum is from Alexander the Great. And so we have Clark leave because, of course, he needs some fresh air. And Clark has rarely been in Metropolis, and so he's like, well, I guess Smallville and Metropolis are really different. And then all of a sudden, Clark is to go on and look at this homeless man with this dog, and he's like, well, maybe they're both the same. So all of a sudden, Clark is to notice that there is this bus coming towards this homeless man, because we come to find out that this bus driver is to have a heart attack and lose control of this bus, or maybe he is to have horrible gas, and I don't know. But this bus is careening out of control. Clark ends up shoving his body into this bus to stop it from moving, and like through this episode and the next episode, we'll start to see that like Clark smashing into the bus, or eventually Clark getting attacked by the Invisible Man and having that thing break onto Clark's face will be a number of consistent visuals that they will use for the intro for a number of years. So we have, of course, Clark that is to use his powers and then eventually runs off. All while we had this Metropolis PD guy named Thielen who's beating the crap out of this informant, and is to tell him the only reason why this guy isn't arrested is because Thielen has not allowed it yet. Thielen is to go on and beat up this informant, or this snitch, and is to all of a sudden see Clark use his abilities, and he's like, aha, like, I'm going to go on and use this guy. So we go on to, of course, have Clark talking to his parents, letting him know what had really and truly happened the night before, after that whole museum, that he went on and used his powers. And his parents is asking him, it's like, well, no one saw you use your powers, right? And Clark is like, well, no. Clark also goes and helps Jonathan with this chain that, of course, Jonathan is struggling with. And so I was just kind of waiting for Jonathan to say, it's like, well, I'm going to up your allowance, like he did before. So we have Clark that makes it back into the barn to eventually see this Metropolis PD badge. And all of a sudden, once Clark is to pick up this badge, all of a sudden there is this pallet and this tractor that ends up falling on top of Clark. And so Clark goes on to eventually chuck this thing aside, and Felon is like, oh wow, I guess like some of those superpowers are going to come in handy. And Clark is realizing that Thielen is going to be there to go on and blackmail Clark to eventually tell him to come to the beanery to eventually tell Clark what he's going to need him for. So Clark goes on to eventually tell Jonathan what had happened, and Jonathan is to say, it's like, well, hey, I'm going to go to the Bean Arena. I'm going to talk to this guy. And so don't you worry about it, Clark. So we also have Clark, we have Chloe, who are at the Torch, and they're, of course, doing their normal day-to-day business. Principal Kwan comes in and is to be very upset by Chloe going on and printing certain articles that he no longer likes. It seems that Chloe is taking the torch and doing stories that Principal Quan does not like. So Principal Quan is finally like this the last straw, and he's firing Chloe. Lana is to be there also, and she is to talk to Chloe and say like, "Well, hey, I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna talk to Quan and I'm gonna see if like we can go on and like and change his mind." So so Lana is to off screen talk to Principal Quan, and eventually Lana goes back in to the torch and lets Chloe know that Lana, for here on out, will supposedly be the new editor, because the Principal Quan is to say that it seems that since Lana was to realize that the torch was so important, maybe Principal Quan wants to see Lana as this new editor. Chloe, of course, gets upset because she feels betrayed by her own friend Lana, saying that it's like, well, like, you're just using this as a resume for a future college application, like, you're not really into this, and so on and so forth. And so Chloe's just very upset that she feels betrayed by her friend, and Lana's like, well, it's not like that at all. I just wanted to get you guys to, like, continue to, like, keep putting out newspaper articles. But so Lana then goes on to eventually take her article to eventually slam Principal Quan, to where, of course, Principal Quan is now upset with the story that is being put together. And so Lana only did that article to eventually like protect her friend, and then Chloe goes on and tells Lana, it's like, well, like, the only reason why I did this whole torch thing is because it's the only thing that me and Clark can do together. And Lana's asking, like, Chloe, it's like, well, like, are you and Clark, like, just friends? And Chloe's like, well, of course we are. And then, of course, Chloe asks Lana, it's like, well, are you and Clark just friends? And Lana's like, well, of course, that's just what we are. So we also get Clark that is to go on and talk to Lex about Thielen, just kind of getting a feel for this guy. And Lex is to mention that he has had some trouble with this guy in the past, and that eventually Clark should just kind of be on the lookout for this guy being very shady. So we have at first that Thielen is to have this private investigator, or private investigator, is to have the internal affairs breathing down Thielen's neck. So what better way to have these people stop breathing by breathing on his neck, by getting rid of the files that are involving Thielen in any kind of wrongdoing. So Thielen takes Clark and is to tell him to go to this room to open up this safe to take these files. And Clark goes into the location that Thielen tells him to go into, and instead Clark goes on and chucks this safe to eventually have this safe smash onto Thielen's car, and eventually the cops are to be coming afterwards. And so Clark is hoping that Thielen is going to get arrested and going to go away for a long time, but come to find out, not really the case. So, because we had Jonathan who goes on and sees Thielen and is to try to convince Thielen to not exploit his son's power, and Jonathan is to try to negotiate with Thielen to say, it's like, well, what else can I give you besides my son? and the only thing that Thielen wants is Clark, and that's all. Like, that's the only thing that Jonathan really has a bargaining chip for, and so Jonathan kind of gets upset to the point of grabbing Thielen, and eventually they just kind of they just get away from one another, and Thielen's like, oh no, hey, yeah, this is fine, and that Jonathan should just kind of watch his temper. So what ends up happening is that Thielen doesn't go away like we assume. And so instead, we end up getting an anonymous tip. And so the police get involved to go to the Kent farm to eventually find this dead body that has this weapon that, of course, would implement that Jonathan had killed somebody. And so Jonathan ends up getting arrested and put into jail, where, of course, Clark has to find Thielen to say, like, you did this. And Thielen is like, well, hey, that's just to tell you that, like, you need to do whatever I say, how I say, and so on and so forth. And so Clark is to go on and speak to Jonathan in prison. And we have the fun moment where Jonathan is to mention to Clark, it's like, well, hey, where's your mother? And Clark is to say to Jonathan, it's like, oh, well, like, she's still being searched, and she'll be here shortly. So by the time that the scene ends, Martha's never there. And so, like, there's some kind of smart things going on here that eventually is like, oh, well, where's Martha? So we have this moment between Clark and between Jonathan where Clark is to mention how he was very aggressive with Thielen and wanted to kill him. Jonathan's like, well, did you? And he was like, well, no. It's like, well, like, we're gonna, like, he ends up putting the fist onto the glass, and so does Clark. It's like, well, we're gonna get through this together, and so on and so forth. And, like, we have this really nice moment between the two of them. So we go on to this episode and have Clark, who's hoping that if he does one last job for Thielen, that eventually all of this will all go away. So, let me pause here for 1 second. Alright, so we have Thielen that takes Clark to this museum to have Clark rip out this security post. But then on top of that is to also have Thielen take Clark to the museum to try to steal that Alexander the Great chess piece that we end up seeing early in the episode. So we have Clark that goes on and is to try to get into the museum to have this chess piece. We have all these police officers that are outside of the building, as well as Lex is to also be outside of the building, because there was some bomb threat that, of course, was actually Thielen calling this in. So Lex is outside the building. So we have Clark that decides to go and take the chess piece that is to be now in this duffel bag, and Clark chucks it out of the window to eventually now tell Thielen that he's going to get arrested for this crime because there's fingerprints all over that chess piece and that are Thielen's, and he's going to get arrested now. Thielen goes and puts out his gun and is trying to go on and shoot Clark, but of course we have this bullet time event where Clark has to slowly start to maneuver and have this bullet not hit him, and eventually Clark has to use super speed to get away. All of a sudden, Thielen is now to be surrounded by these police officers and Lex, and eventually we go on and have Thielen get arrested, and Lex, as well as anybody, is to be so happy that Thielen is to be put away because of how Thielen is to be a douchebag-like character. So we go on and we have Clark that is to eventually find that Jonathan is free of all charges, and then he ended up getting apologized to for all that mix-up. And so Clark is to go on and tell of course, his parents what had all happened. And eventually, Jonathan and Martha are to tell Clark, it's like, well, hey, next time you want to go on and use your powers, just be more cautious about it. And eventually, that's all that they really need to tell him. We also, in these episodes, have Veronica and Lex kind of steaming things up with their business-like relationship, where eventually Lionel is to get involved and just try to break the two up. But Lex is just to be like, oh no, like, we both know that this is going to be like this business relationship, and that's all that it's really going to be, so on and so forth. So let's go on and get into episode 10. So, episode 10, we have a girl named Amy who seems to be infatuated with Lex, to the point where Troy is to want to figure out whether or not that Amy is to still be swooning away for Lex and so on and so forth. And Amy's like, well, yeah, like Lex is like better than any other man, so on and so forth. So since Troy, of course, is giving Amy a hard time, Jeff comes in to try to do the right thing here, to try and stop Troy from giving Amy crap. So we go on and we have Troy, who, of course, is to go into the showers. And so we, of course, have Clark, who is talking to Lana, and evidently Lana is deciding that she wants to go on and eventually donate blood, so that way she can go on and hopefully try to get something on her college resume and so on and so forth. And eventually Clark, I think, is realizing that Lana is trying to get out of something by doing the whole blood donation thing. So we eventually go on to have Clark talking to Pete about the whole donating blood thing, and that Pete is like, yeah, Clark, you should go on and donate blood because like chicks love it when you go and you sacrifice yourself for something as noble as that. So all of a sudden, while Pete and Clark are talking about donating blood, we all of a sudden have somebody who's losing a little blood because, of course, they're getting beaten it out of them by, of course, Troy, who is to go on and be in the locker room, and he all of a sudden is to have these like shoes that are going flying, and all of a sudden this dumbbell that comes flying at him and starts smacking him in the face. Troy is to try to desperately call for anybody else in this locker room, which is just Pete and Clark, and they notice that now Troy is beaten up. And they're like, oh my god. So we go on to transition here. I think after we see that Troy ends up getting beaten up, we get the intro. Somebody save me. Anyways, pushing on. So I believe we're in the beanery, and Whitney, of course, is talking to Lana, and Whitney's like, well, Lana, I think we need some distance between one another, like I need to be alone right now, kind of thing, and so on and so forth. And so Clark and Chloe overhear this whole conversation between both Whitney and Lana, and so they're trying to play dumb, and all of a sudden, Lana is to walk over to Chloe and Clark and just be like, hey guys, and Clark is like, hey, what's going on? And Lana's like, oh, you're playing dumb right now for sympathy for me. I appreciate it. But then Lana is to turn around and ask whether or not Chloe and Clark will want to go on and donate blood, which of course Clark volunteers to eventually help out Lana anyways, to like give people cookies or just help out and sign people up. Because of course Clark can't actually donate blood, and eventually he talks to his parents about it. So Clark is to go on and mention to Jonathan and Martha about donating blood, and so they're like, well, yeah, like you have a problem with needles, so you can't donate blood anyways. And Jonathan is to tell Clark, it's like, well, yeah, that's the one double-edged sword for you having abilities, that you're also going to have to lie to a bunch of people about that you can't do certain things. So we eventually go on in this episode and have Clark, who has a heart-to-heart with Lex about getting Lana. Because we also have Clark, who is to bump into Whitney and find out that Whitney has this prescription for medication and he doesn't know what it's about. So Clark goes on and is to ask Lex about this certain medication, and Lex is like, "Oh, that's a heart medication." And so eventually Clark is to talk to Lex and say like, "Well, hey, like, do you think that like you would go after Lana?" And Lex is like, "Well, yeah, but like that's me, and like you're a different person. You're a different story altogether, and that's the thing that I like about you, Clark, is that you're different than me. Like I would go and do it where you wouldn't, because it's the whole morality kind of thing." So we also have Clark, while talking to Lex, is to all of a sudden notice a bunch of weird, spooky things going throughout the Luthor mansion, and is to eventually notice, because weirdly they have a black light going on in some room, bizarrely. We have Clark realizing that through one of the rooms there is this sign that is throughout Victoria Hardwick's room that says "Leave, go, get out of here," because of course this spirit, of course, is to want Victoria to leave, because this villain of this week hates Victoria. So, as well as we have Amy, who is to be like consistently saying that Victoria is not right for Lex, that that really like they should break up, so on and so forth. She's going on and on and on about it. So we then go on and eventually have Clark within this episode finding out that Victoria is drowning in this tub that she has made a bath for herself. And so Clark goes on and rescues Chloe and is to censor her, of course, as much as he can with a towel and so on and so forth, with his own massive muscular body, to protect the censorship of this woman. And so Clark is to go on and eventually like save Victoria here, to eventually just have Clark also find out that Victoria is to be looking into either Lex's or Lionel's laptop to try to get certain information on Luthor Corp. And Clark goes on to tell Lex about this later on, and Lex is to have some suspicions about that and is to like realize that, yeah, like Victoria has been snooping through Lex's computer to find out information. So Clark is to go on, and while being in this bathroom, is to notice these mirror pieces that have this kind of green kind of substance upon it. And so Clark goes on and takes this to Chloe, and Chloe eventually rubs this upon her skin and then realizes that her fingers are starting to turn invisible. And so Clark makes the assumption of like, well, hey, if you put this all over your body, and Chloe's like, well, yeah, you'd be naked, but Clark is like, but yeah, you'd also be invisible. And so like, aha, like we're figuring out where the villain is in this episode. So Clark and Lana are to have their alone time together, where Lana is to mention to Clark, it's like, well, hey, I haven't gone on and scheduled your appointment, Clark, to donate blood. And Clark is like, yeah, about that. Like, I'm really afraid of needles, so I don't think I can be able to do that. And Lana's like, no, I'm fine with that. But then eventually Clark is to go on and ask Lana. It's like, well, hey, like do you want to be with me in my fortress of solitude, my barn, to go on and like see the sun set one day? And Lana's like, sure, that'd be great. So we go on to eventually have Clark again, who is to meet up with Lex at some point, and it seems that Lex is missing his watch. This watch that is to have been given to him by his mother, and eventually Clark is helping uh, Lex look for this watch that has sentimental value, because Lex is to mention that within this watch there is to be this picture of Napoleon there, and Napoleon is to have had this whole historical story about his mother going on and um, making this certain thing for him, uh, so that way Napoleon will always remember his mother as this watch that Lex's mother gave to him, is so that way Lex will always remember that story and remember his mother. And so like that's kind of the thing about this watch. Clark uses his X-ray vision to look throughout the room and he can't find the watch. So uh for those of you that are keeping track, we I guess tend to use the X-ray vision quite a few times with even in these episodes. And it is kind of funny because I went on and watched the episode of Talkville where eventually Lex and Clark were talking about if they could go on and use X-ray vision, what would it be? And Tom Welling went on to say that he would use the X-ray vision to kind of look for his keys or just certain like common everyday items, and like to kind of look and see this episode now. Isn't that kind of funny how episodes ago they are to have said that? It's kind of funny. So we are to eventually go on into this episode, and I think at also one point, I'm not sure if I said this or not, we had Lionel like conflicting about the whole Lex and Victoria relationship, and he was butting in to say like, "Oh, she's only using you," and he kind of like in some ways he kind of feels like Willem Dafoe with James Franco in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie, where he's like, "Hey, like get what you need out of her, but then broom her fast," kind of thing. That's kind of what it feels like with this situation between Lionel and Lex here, when eventually Lionel is in the episode. And I'm trying to think whatever the heck the other... There's another situation where there's another Chloe moment somewhere in this episode, but I don't remember what it was. I think we had Chloe who was to go on and ask Clark about him volunteering for the whole blood drive thing and what is like his real motives and everything like that about him doing this. And eventually Clark is just like, well, hey, if like Whitney is to like not see like how like valuable like Lana is, then like why can't I come in and just swoop in and get Lana, because like I see how valuable she is, and so on and so forth. And so we have Lex and we have Clark. I think this is the moment where both of them are talking about whether or not that Clark should go after Lana, even though the whole Whitney situation is what it is. When eventually Clark confronts Whitney about the whole medication thing, and then Whitney says it's because of his father's medication, and Whitney's going through a tough time because of that. And so Clark ends up asking Lex about the whole, like, well, should I go after her still? And Lex is like, well, like, I would, but you wouldn't. And that's the difference between the two of us. And all of a sudden, we have both Lex and Clark that bump into Amy again, and all of a sudden, Clark has used his X-ray vision to see that Amy has Lex's watch, and so Clark eventually is to be suspicious that Amy may go on and be the invisible girl here that could be creating all this chaos because of how much Amy doesn't like Victoria, and how I think Clark eventually asks Lex about, like, well, hey, like, does Amy not like Victoria and this and that and so on and so forth? And it's like, yeah, she really doesn't like her. It's like mentioned over and over and over again how she doesn't like her. So Clark and Lex go on to Mrs. Palmer's place to look into Amy's room to see at some point this Lex shrine that eventually has Lex's watch. I kind of am curious if Lex was to ever, or if Michael Rosenbaum was to ever have taken that watch from the show. I wonder if he has the watch. I'm kind of curious. Maybe he probably doesn't. But so, because I know he mentioned he did take a couple of things from the show, but I don't think the watch is one of them. So, Lex is to go on and fire Miss Palmer, but says, like, hey, like, I also think that Amy needs some real like medical help, and like, I'll go on, and any bill that needs to be paid for that, I'm willing to easily pay for her treatment of whatever she needs, because this is very obsessive, and she is like stealing from Lex also. So we have Mrs. Palmer that is to go on and tell Lex that Mrs. Palmer and Amy are packing up everything and leaving right now, but Jeff is going to stay and kind of finish up packing. So we have Clark and Lana, who are to be at the sunset, and we really have Clark who is telling Lana that he only wants to be friends with her, as if this is the very end of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie, where Peter Parker tells Mary Jane that he's only going to be her friend, and that's all that he can give. And like, it feels like that same kind of moment. It feels like this episode kind of really steals from the first Spider-Man movie. But I don't remember exactly when this episode came out, but still, it just kind of weirdly feels like the Spider-Man movie, oddly. So, we then go on and have Clark, who is to meet up with Lex at the Mansion again, to eventually find out who the real villain of this story is. Come to find out, the villain of the story is none other than Jeff. Jeff, of course, was to go on and try to kill Victoria, so that way Lex will go on and see that Amy is the right girl for him, and Lex is to go on and tell Jeff, it's like, well, no, like, your sister is not right for me because she's far too young. It would be illegal. I'm sorry. I just didn't see me dating your sister because she's far too young for me. And so Jeff is going on and beating up Lex pretty badly. And so Clark comes in and is to use his X-ray vision to try to see where exactly Jeff is. And so eventually Clark goes on and gets pretty beaten up by Jeff also, by getting this thing smashed over his head, and is to go and get these items being thrown at him and all kinds of things. So eventually Clark does figure out where Jeff is, and he goes on to eventually get Jeff to smack into this one item, knocking him out, and paint dunks onto him. And so eventually we have Jeff that is getting carted away by this ambulance, and you can see him now. And so we, of course, go on to have like Lex kind of thanking like Clark for saving the day yet again. So we have Clark go home to look at the telescope to notice that Whitney, I guess, is confessing to Lana. We can't tell, but all of a sudden both Whitney and Lana are hugging it out. And so we have to naturally assume that they have like they're kissing and making up. We also see Whitney now having his letter jacket. It's been quite a few episodes since he's had that, and so now I guess maybe his parents bought him another one from the episodes of which that he had lost it episodes ago. So that is to hopefully wrap up most of these episodes. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I forgot about, because I'm sure there's some small detail of these certain episodes that I did probably forget about. Stuff like that happens. Let me know just how you felt about these episodes. I know I didn't really go into like real detail about how I really thought about these episodes, just because really like it's like once we get further and further into these episodes, it's just kind of like, okay, this one was good enough. Like I was willing to watch this one. Like I don't feel like there's certain episodes where I just feel like, man, did that episode just completely like was a filler or was like 100% like a waste to see. So I'm eventually waiting for that time to probably happen where I'm like, man, this episode sucked, or I didn't like it, or blah, 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 blah. But yeah, also I'm more than likely my memory of these episodes may not be the best because it's getting fairly late in the day also. Plus, what I tried to do was I tried to do a review of this and it just didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, so I just redid it here now. So yeah, like I was stumbling and fumbling because I just didn't remember all of episode 10 and what all happened in that. So I just tried to like go on and just like, okay, let's minimalize what I may not exactly know, and just kind of go into figure out what all I can remember, so I can call this a day. So anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye everybody.